Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's impressive for a university to mount an event like this. I congratulate you on the scale of it. It's more and more common for universities to have some kind of internal teaching conference, but not on this scale with this international dimension. So well done for that. Around the world at the moment, governments are pressurizing universities with accountability requirements to do with learning outcomes. In Europe, the Bologna Agreement has made virtually every university rewrite every single curriculum, changing it from traditional models of describing what they're about to specifying things in terms of learning outcomes. And that the Bologna Agreement's being adopted in South America and elsewhere around the world. And other countries have similar initiatives to try and focus attention on student learning outcomes. And the focus of all this work is on measurement, of universities somehow trying to demonstrate to governments and to taxpayers that there are real consequences of university education. My talk this morning isn't about assessment as measurement at all. It's about assessment as the most powerful lever that teachers and universities have to support student learning. I'm much more interested in tolerable or just adequate assessment of very good learning outcomes than I am of very good measurement of impoverished learning that's a direct consequence of the assessment systems that have been designed to meet accountability requirements. Pause for applause, if you like. Okay. A little about myself. At the beginning of my career, I was only a pragmatist. I'm still a pragmatist, but I don't think I'm only a pragmatist anymore. And I wrote books for teachers that had ideas about how to assess, books with tips in, if you like, methods that it looked as though it was quite likely that they might work, though frankly I never had any proof that they did. Gradually I got more and more experience working with teachers, programs, institutions as a consultant, and eventually as a consultant in terms of institutional strategies, including strategies about assessment. And I got a greater feel for the way the thing was organized on a large scale and the environments within which teachers had to design their assessment systems. So there are rules and conventions and cultures that framed the way they did things. And most recently, while I was at Oxford, I was able to pursue a series of research studies that looked at what some of the consequences are of these strategies and framework that surround assessment. I have to get used to the device. I've worked in 3 very different institutions that have helped give me a perspective on different assessment environments. I've worked at the Open University twice. They're a distance learning institution with 200,000 students. They're a kind of education factory, and they have a huge system surrounding what goes on. And if you're responsible for a course at the Open University, the system will tell you that you've got 8 assignments, not 5 or 9, 8 assignments, and they have very detailed tutor feedback on every single one of them, and there's an elaborate quality assurance system that trains people to give good feedback, checks on the quality of feedback, intervenes straight away if tutors don't give thorough and detailed feedback, and so on. The timing is all controlled, and something like 30% of the entire income of the university is allocated to this assignment and feedback system, and that's what drives it as a pedagogic system. It's regular assignments with detailed feedback. People tend to think of the Open University as about learning materials, but from the student's point of view, it's about assignments and feedback. I've worked at Oxford Brookes University twice, once when it was Oxford Polytechnic. They have an assessment system that's driven by coursework, and the coursework carries most of the marks. So something like 90% of all marks at Oxford Brookes come from coursework, not from examinations. And it's increasingly become a systematic course design institution where learning outcomes are specified, assessment is aligned with the learning outcomes, criteria are aligned with both, and you have this great panoply of outcomes, each one of which is assessed. And so it's led to a great deal of assessment, a great deal of marking, of measurement of outcomes. It does exactly what the Bologna Agreement tells universities it should do, and they've been doing it for years. And then I moved to Oxford that does none of those things. It doesn't have any learning outcomes. It has almost no criteria other than things like an upper second degree is slightly better than the lower second but not quite as good as the first. It's just about what the criteria consist of. and it does almost all its measurement through examinations that happen at the end of 3 years. And it completely separates out all the stuff that's to do with learning and all the stuff that's to do with measurement. It does the opposite of Oxford Brookes. It's quite interesting to conceive of the sheer range of assessment systems that exist, all under the same national quality assurance arrangements, which makes you wonder about how much leverage there is in quality assurance arrangements if they can produce such different systems. I get the hang of it soon. Okay, I'm going to focus in on the phenomena I'm interested in you thinking about this morning by giving you some quotes from various studies of assessment. So this is the student's voice and the student's experience of assessment. This is a student from MIT, the top technology university in the world. And it's in a book called The Hidden Curriculum, and it's about students trying to work out not what the documentation says about what you're supposed to do, but what you actually have to do if you want to get a good grade with the least possible effort. So it describes a parallel universe that students have to relate to that's nothing to do with the formal universe, that they have to learn to negotiate. It's a very powerful book. It was produced 40 years ago, and I recommend that you read it if you possibly can. You don't take the whole course. You excise a good bit of the course immediately. Now this was a parallel qualitative study at the University of Edinburgh, another very research-intensive university, interestingly at much the same time. And the researchers here distinguished 3 types of students, and they called them Q-seeking, Q-conscious, and Q-deaf. And the Qs were cues about what really counted in the assessment system. So the Q-conscious student, the lecturer would say, now this is really important, and the student would go, aha, and they'd underline it in red in their notes and put a note in the margin. And the Q-seeking student would take the lecturer down the pub and buy them beer and hope they'd let slip what was going to come up in the examination. And the Q-deaf student, no matter how often you told them, it just went straight over their heads. And they were able to categorize students by interviewing them about their approach to the assessment system, and it turns out that's all they needed to know to predict their degree results, the extent to which they were cued into the system. Not how hard they worked, not what their school grades were. They just needed to know how well they could play the game that MIT had described. I still haven't learned which way round this. Oh, no, that was right. Okay. This came from Oxford Polytechnic. They used to have very short terms, and they would cram in one assignment in week 7 and an exam in week 10 or 11. And the students often didn't get the feedback before the exam from the assignment because they had such a lot to mark all in one go. And there are other contexts where there were several assignments, and they followed on one from the other rather quickly, and the feedback came after they'd already done the next assignment and things like this. And from the Open University also I got quotes from students saying things like, well, I'm never going to study that topic again in my life, so why would I read the feedback? And there are studies by Dye Hounsel at Edinburgh and other places about what students do with feedback. In some cases, what proportion of essays are picked up from the departmental office after they've been marked, and it's a really disappointing proportion. And so begin to see is that even when teachers were taking feedback on assignments seriously, it wasn't doing the job that was anticipated. That the available evidence about students' use of feedback is deeply depressing. This is what Americans call faking good. And this is from an engineering course at the University of Coventry, and it's student describing the game they play, trying to get marks by presenting their work in a particular way. But this student's able to distinguish between what would have resulted in more learning and what would have resulted in more marks. And they're different things. What would have resulted in more learning is including all the blind alleys they went down and all the mistakes they made and getting comments from the tutor back on those and why some strategies are better than others. Whereas what gets the mark is pretending that you got there once, the first time correctly, and focusing on the answer rather than the process. And these students were perfectly aware of the difference between learning and getting marks in the process. I can remember as an undergraduate in my psychology essays citing more references than I had read. I'm sure students at Singapore wouldn't do this, but I did. This is a postgraduate oceanography student. I still don't understand the subject, so it defeated the object in a way. I like the in a way bit here. This is perceiving that what gets marks in examination is mindless regurgitation of information that you don't understand. And that trying to understand the stuff actually got in the way of getting marks. So you could make a choice. You could get marks or you could understand it. And so this is a student perceiving that, no, it may have been a misperception, except that it seems to have had certain consequences here, perceiving that the demands are not those that produce good learning. So what is rewarded is the wrong stuff. And this is from MIT as well. Okay. So I'm sure it's not all like this, but the reality is many students' experience of assessment is not a happy one. They can see a difference between what teachers and institutions try to do for measurement and what they believe would support their learning better. And they can spot this really easily. If you just listen to your students, they'll tell you all kinds of stuff. And I think these orientations have become more and more dominant because students have become more and more strategic. As their education becomes more expensive, it becomes a higher stakes game. In many of my interviews with students, when I first meet them to sit down to interview them, I say something casual to break the ice like, how are you getting on? And they say 62.47. And they know exactly how they're getting on, and they know exactly what they need to do to get 65 rather than 62.47. Another thing that fascinates me about measurement and its consequences is how redundant it is. I remember a study by Dave Bowd in Australia where he simply asked first-year students to predict what degree classification they were going to get and then followed it up 3 years later, and they all knew in the first year. Now, there's a kind of logical flaw in just accepting students' guesses in the first year rather than measuring. But you wonder what the value added here is if students broadly already know. And then there's a data I encountered in a workshop at the University of Portsmouth. And I've been doing work on large classes, but they weren't messing around with pedagogy. They called the workshop they'd asked me to run Saving Staff Time. They were cutting straight to the action on this. And one of the people it was a science faculty, and one of the people in the faculty had done an analysis of the assessment data. So he produced a spreadsheet that he showed us, and every row on the spreadsheet was a student's name, and every column was a different occasion in which a mark was allocated to a piece of work that eventually contributed to their degree classification. And there were 115 columns on this spreadsheet. So column 65 could have been lab report 4 in the course in the second year or something like that. So 115 columns. And he did a discriminant function analysis. So you see which of these columns, these assessments, contribute least to discriminating between the students in terms of the degree classification they got, and you throw the column away to see if it makes any difference. And he did it, and it didn't. It might have been that lab report in the second year, and he threw that away, and everybody got the same degree classification. So he did the analysis again and identified the next column that contributed least to discrimination, and threw that away, and he carried on throwing columns away until the first student out of 80 got a different result. So this is a very sensitive measure, by which time he only had 6 columns left. So you've got over 100 of these assessments contributing absolutely nothing at all to discriminating between students. And Noel Entwistle has told me he's done the same analysis at Edinburgh and found exactly the same thing. So you wonder, why are we doing all this? Well, not only is it having all these negative consequences for students, but it's redundant. Okay, I'm going to now move from a focus on the students to a focus on courses and the way assessment works within courses. I'm going to use some little cases to illustrate some phenomena, and then try and unpack the phenomena and see if we can get at the underlying principles. So the logic of this bit of the talk is examples, principles, and then we'll see what happens if you take the principles seriously. The first case here, the case of the engineer, comes from the University of Strathclyde. The traditional pattern of teaching on an engineering course was 2 lectures a week, a problem sheet handed out at the lecture that contained problems of the kind that the lecturer had been talking about. The students are meant to go away over the next week and tackle the problems. They come back the next week to a problem class, relatively small group, where they talk with the teacher about the problems. Now what happened is student numbers went up. So the problem classes got much, much bigger. And the students discovered that the teacher couldn't afford to mark all these anymore. They used to mark them and hand them back. There's just too much to do. You couldn't get through it all. So they stopped marking them. And the students discovered that in the problem classes, if you avoided eye contact, you could get away with the fact that you hadn't even looked at the problems. This is quite a successful strategy. And the consequence of this is that the exam mark, which was pretty mediocre to start off with, went down to 45%, the average, and the pass mark was 40, so you're beginning to get a lot of failures. Now they thought, well, this isn't acceptable, we're going to have to make some changes here. They looked to Australia, where the class sizes had gone up a little bit earlier, to see what kind of ideas they came up with, and they invented something based on an Australian model, and it looked like this. They said to the students, if you look at the whole range of problems we give you over the course, there's about 60 of them, and you're going to have to do 50 of them. You're going to have to show us evidence that you've had a go at 50 problems, and this is a course requirement. If you can't fulfill that, you're not allowed to sit the exam. All the marks are going to come from the exam. We're going to check whether you've done these problems or not in sessions that happen in a tiered lecture theatre just like this. And the students would come in with their pile of problems, put it on the table at the front. An administrator would quickly shuffle them into piles and distribute them randomly around the room. The students would sit down, and next to them would be the kind of marking scheme that a postgraduate student would need if they were helping out with the marking, and a pile of other students' problems, and they would mark these problems using the problem sheet. They wouldn't do it the way a teacher would do it, would say, well done, Brian, this is a really good attempt at this problem. They would say, Brian, you moron, you don't do it like this. Because they knew Brian, and they knew Brian was a moron. And this was visceral feedback. And some of it was wrong, so they'd say it was right when it wasn't, or they'd say it was wrong and it was correct. And they scrawled things all over the work, and they got through the pile, came down the front, and administrators shuffled it back into student piles. You collect your pile that had been marked by other students around the room, and left the room and looked at the feedback. The lecture stayed the same, the problems were the same, the exams were the same, and the average mark went up to 85% in the exam. And the question is, what is going on? And in fact, I'm going to leave you just for a moment. You might want to talk to the person next to you. Why did it work? I'm not interested in the fact that just that it worked. I'm interested in why that it worked. What pedagogic work is going on here that makes this so successful? Just a minute or two on your own or with the person next to you. Why did it work? just enough to get your mental juices working. These were engineers, so they presented the results and said it worked. So they never wrote up why it worked, they just presented the data. So we'll never know why it worked. So mine are guesses as well as yours here. But here's my guesses. The first thing is that they did the problems. There's one of the American 7 principles of good practice on undergraduate education is called time on task. And the principle is, if you don't spend time on it, you won't learn it. And that the primary responsibility of teachers in organising a course is to make sure that students spend enough time on the right things. It's not giving good lectures, that hardly makes any difference at all. What matters is students spend enough time on the right things, and the main leverage you have to get students to spend enough time on the right things is to design your assessment system properly. That's where the leverage lies. The next thing is an interesting phenomena that works very differently in different discipline areas. If you're an architect, do we have an architect in the house? Oh, brilliant. My guess is that your students present their work on the walls in public, that they design things and then students and teachers gather round, it's usually called a crit, and they talk about the designs and then the teacher will come back and put a mark on it. Students' work is public. The consequence of your work being public is that students take great pride in it. Music students will work 25 hours a day for the week before the public performance they give. Making the consequence of your student learning public completely change the quality of student attention to that work. And things like peer assessment go some way towards making your learning public, and students pay attention to it differently. It's a very interesting social phenomenon. Timely and influential feedback. This is another one of the American 7 principles of good practice. Firstly, feedback has to be quick or it's a waste of time. Quick and dirty feedback appears to have much more impact than slow and perfect feedback. And this is a really important thing, because teachers think that their job is to produce perfect feedback. It isn't. It's to get it back fast enough so that it makes a difference. And it has to be influential. And I'm guessing that in this case, other students writing stuff all over, got your attention. And you had to look at it and say, is this feedback right? Are they really right about that? And think about it. That student paid more attention to second-class feedback from other students than they would have done to first-class feedback from teachers. But the crucial thing here is that it's timely. And then there's a whole area of influences that are to do with learning by assessing. You notice the mistakes other people make. You develop judgment by practicing making judgment. And once you've done that, you can start supervising yourself. You can notice things in your own work. It's the same happens with academics and peer review. You get feedback on the first journal article you submit, and that makes you pay attention to your next journal article much more carefully. And there's a process. And being a peer reviewer, you notice things by making judgments which you think, actually, I don't even do that in my own articles, and those kind of processes. It's the business of peer review changes the way you look at your own work and brings different awarenesses into that. I'm going to elaborate on a couple of other examples. I'm not trying to sell you these as tactics. I don't mind whether you use them or not. I'm going to go on and look at what are the principles underneath them. But first some more examples, because when I started looking into this area, I read across a whole series of journals, accountancy education, assessment evaluation in higher education, looking at write-ups of case studies where people had changed assessment and there was some reasonably convincing evidence that it worked, and I was trying to understand why. I was looking for the principles, and I looked at hundreds and hundreds of these things across different subject areas. The psychologist one I really love. These were psychology lecturers writing feedback on lab reports, psychology lab reports, and they would write, you have not labelled the axes of your graphs. And then next week they'd look at a student report and they'd say, you still have not labelled the axes of your graphs. And they spent their life writing exactly the same feedback on hundreds of students' work, week after week, year after year. And a group of these psychologists were in a pub crying into their beer, telling each other jokes about the things they wrote on feedback and how pointless it all was. And they had a really bright idea, and they brainstormed, wrote it down on the back of beer mats. They brainstormed the most common things they wrote on lab reports, and they produced an A4 sheet with about 80 of these written in 6-point times with a little tick box next to it. And so instead of writing, "You have not labelled the axes of the graphs," they could just tick a box next to the statement. And they thought, this will avoid repetitive strain injury. And then they had a much brighter idea, and they gave this sheet to the students and said, when you submit your lab reports, clip this to the front and tick all the things you've done wrong. They got technically perfect lab reports the first time they did it. And they'd spent the last 10 years of their lives doing this job for students. Students had to do it for themselves. They immediately had to change the criteria to more advanced things about sophistication of experimental design in order to spread the marks out again, because everybody was getting the basics right. And you think, well, this is a very interesting phenomenon here. You know, what proportion of all our marking is doing stuff that students could perfectly easily do for themselves or for each other, and to much greater impact? The accountant one is a different kind. This is one I definitely wouldn't recommend you doing unless you've got a good lawyer. There was an accountancy course that was frankly threadbare. It was absolutely vast class. It was lectures. Students were given sheets with accountancy exercises of the kind the lecturer was lecturing about, and then there was an exam at the end of the course, and that's all it was. So this is a pretty threadbare course. But student performance was terrible. Lots of students failed the exam. Lots of students failed the resit and were thrown out of the accountancy degree program as a consequence, because this was a required course. The lecturer spotted a method used in a medical program in London, got permission of the dean to do this, and the very first lecture of the course he said, if you look at your course guide, you will see that you have been allocated to a learning team of 4. And everybody looked, and there's their name and 3 others. This has been done randomly. There is no appeal. That is your group of 4. You will take this course in whatever way you feel right. You will sit the exam on your own, but then you will get the average mark of your team of 4. I'd like you to think about the way you would behave as a learner on that course. Apart from phoning your lawyer, what would you do as a student on that course if those were the rules? Well, you'd look around and you'd find who the other 3 were, and you'd make sure they turned up to lectures. If they missed a lecture, you'd go and find them and sit them down and talk them through the notes. They revised together in little revision groups. The performance went through the roof. It was absolutely stunning. And the dean said, OK, provided the students agree, and he got them to agree, you can do it, but I'm not going to let any individual student pass this course who failed the exam just because the group average is above 40%. So some of the students had to take a resit, but the resit still counted towards the group average, so the other 3 tutored them through the resit. And they got no failures. For the first time in the entire history of the accountancy department, they got 100% of students through the course. And it was free. Now, this is pretty stunning. Performance increases of that kind at no cost are relatively unusual, but this is quite a small change in a course. So my message here is one of, it's to do with scale of changes. You can make quite small tweaks to existing assessment systems, and student learning behaviour is absolutely transformed. It doesn't always happen, but these are really nice examples here. Okay. Reading across a whole load of these, I pulled out what I've called conditions under which assessment supports student learning. So if you see these things going on, there's a reasonable chance that learning will be well supported on your course. Some of these will be fairly obvious from the examples I've given you. So first, you've got to capture sufficient student time and distribute it fairly evenly across the things that matter. You can't afford students to only put a little bit of time in on this, that and the other, and it's not going to work like that. So if you asked your students, draw me a time graph of how hard you work each week on the course, is it going to be plummeting to a low level, raised for the assignment in week 7 and then up again for the exam at the end? I mean, what's it going to look like? And what you need is an assessment system that gets something at a fairly high level, reasonably evenly across the course. It needs enough time. I suspect the biggest quality problem that British higher education has at the moment is students don't put the hours in. It's really as simple as that. It's nothing to do with lecturing or course design. Students don't put the hours in. And changed assessment systems can make sure students put the hours in. The things you get students to do have to bring the right qualities of engagement with the task, so not memorization, something that is going for understanding, a deep approach, something that inspires them, interests them, involves them in social activity which is motivating, has some kind of problem or inquiry engagement which again is naturally motivating. So there's some kind of dynamic about the task which brings the right quality of engagement with the task. And the next one is another one of the American 7 principles of good practice. Is that good practice communicates clear and high expectations. It's not just clear what you're supposed to do, but it's clear that it's going to be challenging. I've sat in a lecture theatre at the briefing session at the beginning of a course and heard students whisper to each other, "This one's going to be easy." And they've spotted it in the first 5 minutes of briefing of the first lecture. Now, what they ought to be saying is, my goodness, they're really going to work as hard on this, but it looks as though it's possible. You need some sense of, a credible challenge, something that's going to be perceived as demanding, that will raise the stakes in terms of student commitment and effort. So it's not just clear what they're supposed to do, but it's going to be challenging. You need both at once. All the rest of these are about feedback, and I'm not going to apologise for that because it's clear from meta-analysis of huge numbers of interventions in education which of all the things that teachers or schools or universities can do make most difference to student learning, and you rank order them in terms of effect sizes. The ones at the bottom are structural and bureaucratic, so reorganising departments, bringing in a new quality assurance regime usually has negative impacts on things. The ones at the top that have the biggest impacts are to do with, mainly to do with feedback. It's feedback that has the leverage. It's the crucial ingredient of learning is feedback systems. So the rest of these are about feedback. Firstly, it has to be enough of it, and it has to be in enough detail. It has to be provided quickly enough to be useful. The student's got to be able to do something with it. It focuses on learning, so it will get students to think about their learning rather than think, I am a hopeless person. So grades are rather bad at this. A B- means, to students means, I am a B- person, whereas qualitative feedback gets them to think about the learning. The feedback's got to somehow focus on the learning, not the person. And it's got to be understandable. I could elaborate on this for a while, but I'll just give one example. My older daughter studied sociology at the University of Warwick, and she got one essay back, and there was just one comment on the bottom, and it said, "Not sociological enough." And she said to me, if I'd known how to be sociological enough, I'd have done it. There's no end of research on students having no idea what lecturers are referring to in the comments they write on assignments. Students just don't understand what they're being told. And then the last one is, there's no point in giving this feedback if students can't use it to do something differently next time. In fact, the most important aspect of feedback is that it feeds forwards. Students hardly ever go back into topics and revise them. I've got a questionnaire, I'll show you about this, and students just don't do it. But what they do sometimes do is change what they do next for the next topic. When I was studying feedback at the Open University, all these courses had 8 assignments. They all had quality assurance on the quantity and quality of feedback. But some of these courses, it was clear students were using the feedback much more than on other courses, and I couldn't see why. And I went into one course that had completely different ratings from students about the extent to which they paid attention to and used the feedback. And it turned out that the 8 assignments were linked. The first one fed into the second one, the second into the third, and they're all mopped up in the 8th assignment. Now you'd be an idiot not to use the feedback in a context like that. And it seems to be designing assignments in sequences that are linked that gets feedback used. And the greater the extent to which assignments are completely separate, the less the chance there is that feedback will be useful to students. Just a couple of quickies to illustrate some of these in action, because sometimes for some people it's the examples rather than principles that carry the message. In bioscience at Liverpool, they've given up getting students to write individual lab reports in some courses and give feedback, and instead they get groups to put their data together and produce a conference poster which goes up on the wall, and at the beginning of the next lab session everybody walks around, looks at the posters and writes graffiti on each other's posters. And it works much better. Students they work better in the lab because they've got to pool their data in a sensible way. They talk with other students about what's going on so they make sense of it. They feel pride in their poster, so they do a very good job of presenting it. And then there's a peer review and critique process, and it's free. Law. They had resources to mark one essay in a law course, and it was clear that students only paid deep level attention to one topic on the course as a consequence and ignored the other 7 because they only did one essay. So they said, right, new system, 6 essays, and it's a requirement to produce 6, so you can't sit the exam. The first 3, as soon as you submit it, we're going to post you electronically a model answer. You don't get the model answer till you submitted your essay. There's no other feedback, but you have to submit an essay. And we've got some software to check if it's plagiarized, by the way. The second 3, they said, one of these 3 we're going to mark, but we're not going to tell you which one it is, so you're going to have to take all 3 seriously. Now, this sampling issue is a very clever one. What we normally do in examinations is sample the curriculum. You can't ask examination questions about every single topic, and it's considered culturally acceptable to only ask exam questions about a small proportion of the course. But you can do it the other way round. You can get students to do absolutely everything and then only sample it for marking. It's exactly the same strategy, but it's much more successful about capturing and distributing student time and effort. So the crucial thing for institutional policy here is that you're allowed to use course requirements. You're not allowed to do this unless that. Here, you can't sit the exam unless you've submitted 6 essays. And then you use sampling to reduce the marking load. Cunning, eh? Okay. I developed a questionnaire to measure the consequence of assessment environments for various aspects of what's going on. It proved to be surprisingly difficult. My colleague Keith Trigwell helped a lot with this, and the last 4 scales on this questionnaire actually come from the course experience questionnaire. But the first 4 are to do with the conditions that you've seen above there. And eventually we get measured, so we get scores on scales of students saying, this is how I respond to the assessment environment. So the quantity and distribution effort, there are statements like, on this course you have to study virtually everything if you want to do well. Okay, so that kind of captures that kind of issue. I then used this questionnaire across large numbers of courses at different universities to try and understand what was going on. And the differences between whole universities were larger than differences between courses. So there seemed to be institutional cultures about the way the assessment was operating. So I only study things that are going to be covered in the assignments. 4 times as many people agree with that in one university as another. I mean, that's a big difference. And this is across different courses. On this course, I get plenty of feedback on how I'm doing. That's an enormous difference. So it's culturally acceptable in University B that doesn't happen very often. Now, they will have a quality assurance system. Both of these universities operate under the National Quality Assurance Agency system rules and got visited and checked out how they did things. And yet still there are these huge variations. University A was ranked top in the National Student Survey for teaching. So this matters. And then I went to Oxford. You don't do any of these quality assurance things. They don't have learning outcomes, they don't have criteria, they don't align assessment with outcomes, they hardly have any assessment marks at all. They have a totally floppy and unquality assured formative feedback system called the tutorial system, in which students write essays or do other work and then sit down in very small groups, 2 or 3 or 4 students and a tutor, and discuss their work with the tutor. And that's completely separate from the examination system that happens later, to the point that the tutors have no idea what's going to be examined, and it's deliberate. Despite that, Oxford came out as top on the National Student Survey. It's ranked first for teaching by the Times and the Guardian newspapers. It's got the best course experience questionnaire scores of any university in the world. It's got 98% student retention. You virtually have to die not to complete at Oxford. And it has stunning performance PIs while doing none of the things that the Quality Assurance Agency tells them they should do. This is worth exploring, frankly. So I was interested in what are the characteristics of degree programs, the overall assessment environment that's associated with these wonderful student responses in terms of learning, not just them ranking it high, but behaving in appropriate ways and learning effective ways. And are these characteristics the ones that the Quality Assurance Agency and Bologna Agreement and other of these national and pan-national systems, are they the ones that they're trying to sell and force universities to use? So I chose 3 very different kind of universities, all of which had quite good students. So these were all best of their type universities that were attractive to students. I chose 3 subject areas that I assumed would have very different kinds of assessment and 1 degree program in each of those areas in the 3 universities. And I characterized the researcher who was working with me, and she did most of the work, frankly, looked at exactly how does the assessment system work, what does it consist of, and I'll tell you about what we looked at. We administered the assessment experience questionnaire to find out how students responded, and we did focus group interviews to get student quotes of the kind of things they said about their experience, and then we looked at the relationship between the two, the characteristics of the assessment system and how students respond. So it's Harriet who did a lot of the work on this. So these are the characteristics we look at. What proportion of marks come from exams? How many times are marks stuck on bits of work? How many times are there assignments that are purely for learning purposes with no marks on them? How many hours do students experience of oral feedback over 3 years? How many words of feedback are written on assignments over 3 years? How quickly, on average, do assignments come back to students with feedback on them? How explicit are the criteria? That's a qualitative judgment. And how aligned is the assessment with learning outcomes? Is this a rational course design system or not? And for each of those variables, we categorized the degree program as high, medium, or low in such a way that it spread the degree programs across the categories so that we could tell the difference between high and low and see if it made any difference to student learning. The first thing is the sheer diversity here was just staggering. Proportion of marks from exams between 17% and 100%. Number of times students worked over 3 years, between 11 and 95. Can you imagine one university having 9 times as many lectures as another university? I mean, the one that had only 1/9 as much lectures, it would be a national scandal. It'd be on the front page of newspapers. And yet that's what happens in terms of assessment. Kind of intriguing. Formative-only assessment. We know from literature that formative-only assessment works better than summative assessment to support learning. Work with feedback and no marks produces better than learning with feedback and marks or marks only. And yet there's this enormous, enormous variation in the extent to which it happens. And the literature is really clear about if you want to support student learning, do formative-only assessment. One of these degree programs, it happened twice in 3 years. Number of hours of oral feedback, between 3 hours over 3 years and 68 hours. If you categorize these, the institutions were completely different. The traditional research university was the exact opposite of the modern teaching university, and the modern research university was somewhere in between on the variables. They were chalk and cheese, diametrically opposed systems. If you plot the number of times that there's formative-only assessment, work with no marks, and the number of times there's stuff with marks on a graph, so the vertical axis on this, the vertical axis is how many times the students asked to do work where there wasn't a mark on it, it was purely for learning purposes, and the bottom axis is how many times were things marked. This is the traditional research university here. This is the modern teaching university here, and this here is the modern research university that did neither. you'll notice there's nobody up here. So if you look at what's going on, you either get lots of formative only assessment or lots of marking, but you don't get both because you can't afford both. These seem to be resource alternatives. You decide how to spend your money. You can spend it giving feedback, or you can mark everything that moves, but you can't do both. Nobody does both. It's a tactical decision you can make. And then the institution that was bottom left, the modern research university that didn't have much formative assessment or much summative assessment, we know from national data in Britain, those universities have the least student effort. There is not enough in the assessment system to get students to work at all. Amazingly, the top research universities that are modern research universities in Britain have the students who put least work in. This is a pretty tragic situation to find yourself in. That comes from the Centre for Higher Education, the Higher Education Policy Institute. It's a national survey about student workload and the amount of teaching they get. Their assumption was that if there was more teaching, students would work harder. The opposite is the case, interestingly. Okay, so then you look at the relationship, and you find that if you do the things the Quality Assurance Agency asks you to do, so you have explicit criteria and standards, you align assessment with your outcomes, which means as you've got umpteen outcomes, you've got umpteen assessments, and you spend all your money on marking, but you do it in a rigorous and systematic way, that has comprehensively negative consequences for student learning. For every single variable, students were taking a surface approach to a greater extent, a deep approach less. They were distributing their time very strategically across topics and hardly studying any of the syllabus, and so on and so on. Every measure on the assessment experience questionnaire. Where you found lots of formative only assessment, oral feedback, written feedback, it happened quickly. You got very good student learning, even though there was no sign of systematic course design. So these students were clearer about goals and standards, even though they weren't specified. I'll say that again because it's such an extraordinary thing. The students in these contexts were clearer about what they were supposed to be doing and the standards they were supposed to be achieving, even though it wasn't written down. And they gained their understanding by multiple cycles of formative assessment. They learnt gradually through repeatedly doing things and getting feedback on it what it was all about. The students, where it was written down in great detail in 5 pages in their course guides, hadn't got a clue what the goals and standards were. None of the words made any sense to them at all. I went back and read the literature about the behavioural objectives movement that gradually petered out in the 70s in America, that, although you still see bits of it lying around, that was established in the 50s, which was the previous attempt on learning outcomes. Write everything down, define everything in advance, measure in great detail exactly what you said you were going to do. And studies about that showed that the teachers themselves didn't understand the objectives. Words like synthesize, they had no idea what they were talking about. And it was a great myth that you could capture somehow the meaning of this simply by writing it down. That the understanding of these goals and standards are in the community. They're a kind of cultural phenomena, and you get to understand them by engaging with the community repeatedly and talking about it, and eventually you understand what that community means by quality. And it's a slow, busy, messy process, and you can't do it in rational, systematic ways. It just doesn't work. Okay. The students at the modern teaching university had this bewildering variety of cunningly designed assessments, each of which was specifically designed to measure a different learning outcome, and they were just confused. They had no idea what was going on. They only ever got one go at doing something. The next course they were asked to do something completely different. They had no idea how to do it. They were bemused by the whole system. The idea that writing it down made it clear was a complete myth. It's clearly teachers where everything had marks on were constrained by examination regulations that get the marks right and to assure that there wouldn't be any student appeals and get them checked and all those kind of things. And it just slowed everything up. So the work got back to students much slower when there's just feedback and there's no marks and you don't have to worry about all that examination business. You can just hand it back straight away. And it was handing it back straight away that did the job. So the worrying about reliability of marks was greatly impinging on the effectiveness of all the huge resources that were put into feedback. Another possible alternative explanation here is that it's really modularity that is the villain of the piece here, rather than some aspects of assessment. They're interlinked. Oxford is not modular. Traditional research universities tend not to be modular. The modern universities were, and their courses were short, and they had to pack the assessment into a small number of weeks, and you finished being taught on Thursday and sat the exam on Friday. At Oxford, you finish the teaching about February and you sit the exam in May, and you've got loads of time to do integration and those kind of things. That non-modular systems allow gradual development of student sophistication over time, long sequences of assignments and feedback gradually developing students' understanding. And the modular system prevented any of that accumulation and development. It was all one stop, that's finished with, next thing stop, that's finished with. And the assessment system had to be packed into these tight boxes. There's a movement in Britain at the moment, even though virtually everybody has modularized, to go back to something like the old system by having long, big modules. So instead of being 10 credits, they're now 50 credits and things like that, to try and build back in some of those features that allowed sequences of assignments, feedback to help the next thing. So we're actually going back within modular structures to old systems. I think some of the preoccupations of teachers and universities are misplaced. I think it's assessment they should be paying attention to. There's more leverage there than anywhere else. You get a bigger bang for your buck by investing time and effort in changing assessment than you do anywhere else. I think some of the changes are both easy and incredibly economical. In fact, by and large, my message would be, try and get students to do for themselves and for each other what teachers had previously done for them, and it will be cheaper and it will work better. I think it's clear that many universities are imposing quality assurance guidelines and regulations that virtually guarantee that student learning is damaged. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.